Hello, and welcome to Human Stories. My name is Heather Mellquist Lehto, and I am a cultural anthropologist, currently working as a postdoctoral fellow at Arizona State University. Over the past decade, I have researched religion, science, and technology in South Korea and the United States. And today, in this video, I'm going to be talking to you about South Korean multi-site churches. Now, you may be wondering, what is a multi-site church? Well, broadly speaking, a multi-site church is a single church that meets at multiple locations. This can be multiple spaces within a larger campus, or it may be several church buildings throughout a region, or maybe it's several congregations that meet together in several countries around the world. People might be familiar with one of the most famous multi-site churches today, which is Hillsong Church, where celebrities like Justin Bieber attend, a sanctuary in New York, which is a campus of an Australian multi-site church. Today in 2021, it is very common for large megachurches to be multi-site churches. This allows them to spread out in multiple locations rather than piling into a single stadium-sized church. Usually they do this by recording worship services in one sanctuary and broadcasting it to a series of satellite campuses. Now, the transformation of mega churches into multi-site churches has happened fairly quickly over the last 2 decades. Since the year 2000, over 75% of all mega churches in the world have become multi-site churches, adopting a more franchise-like structure. As you can see here, the transformation in the United States has been fairly recent, really since the mid-2000s. This raised a number of questions for American Christians, including how can a multi-site church create community across a number of different campuses? If the head pastor isn't physically present, how does that change the relationship between the pastor and the congregation? How will the reliance on media technologies affect religious rituals? And what does the multi-site church model offer for Christians? So I first became interested in the multi-site church sort of transformation by watching how it unfolded in the United States. But what most people don't know, and that I learned in the course of my research, is that South Korea created some of the first multi-site churches in the world in the late 1980s. In fact, South Korean multi-site churches had several campuses operating transnationally before American and Australian churches started to experiment with this model in the 2000s. And some American churches even borrowed ideas and principles from the example of South Korean churches. So this is all to say that we can learn a lot by looking at how what is the new normal for mega churches around the world kind of developed over the last 30 or so years in South Korea. We can look into the experience of South Korean Christians to help us answer some of these questions that are of interest to newer multi-site churches. And so today I'm going to be sharing a few key things that I've learned from my research within these churches. First of all, what does participation look like in these churches? Do people feel a sense of belonging if they attend a smaller or satellite campus that is removed from where the head pastor preaches? People have a wide range of experiences, of course. For example, at Korean churches in the US, it's really important for some congregants to maintain their identification with the other sites of the church in Korea. This was perhaps their motivation to attend a campus church as opposed to any other local congregation. They wanted to feel like they shared a part in the same congregation that they may have known already in South Korea. But for other congregants, the existence of other campuses doesn't really matter to them nearly as much. But something that I found particularly surprising was that most people said that attending a campus of the larger church actually gave them a greater sense of participation and belonging. This is because they felt like they could make a greater contribution to the religious life of a smaller campus community rather than they ever could at such a large megachurch that might have as many as 1 million congregants in it. So in the smaller community, they had more opportunity to do things like lead Bible studies and sing in the choir or run the media technologies that the services often depend on. From the perspective of the pastors, however, their work in a multi-site church is often fundamentally different than in a more traditional church setting. Most often, what happens across the campuses is that the responsibilities of each pastor will become more specialized. The head pastor at the main sanctuary of a church is usually the one who does a significant part of the preaching. And this is the preaching that is broadcast across the whole network of church campuses. But this frees up other pastors to focus on other activities such as counseling congregants or leading music programs or doing administrative work for the church. So while some pastors might wish that they had more opportunity to preach, many pastors told me that they appreciated that tasks were delegated in this way, so they felt like they could really focus on their strengths rather than being responsible for all of the different types of work that are often required in the service of a pastor. In multi-site churches where the head pastor does the majority of the preaching, however, this often has the unintended consequence of making the particular pastor especially central to how people see the church. This is because this is the single person that is viewed in common among all of the sites. So while most pastors express their desire to avoid the sort of cult of personality that is often a drawback of large or mega churches with a charismatic leader, the way that multi-site churches feature a head pastor as the primary preacher means that many congregants see the pastor as kind of defining what the church is. In South Korea in particular, it's notable that many of these pastors are now at the time of retirement or death, and this has caused a lot of challenges in terms of creating a sense of unity as the church transitions over to a new head pastor. Now, the use of media technologies often play a really pivotal role in multi-site churches. In fact, for some services at satellite campuses, large projection screens and televisions are prominently placed throughout the church because this is how the sermon is shared with the congregants. So congregants go to the church sanctuary and they will usually sing all the hymns and perhaps pray together with the local congregation. But otherwise, they will sit together and they will watch the sermon as it is broadcast on the screen. The use of certain media technologies does, of course, affect the service. For example, congregants cannot directly speak to the pastor before or after the sermon and perhaps let him know directly what they thought of the message. Also, the pastor cannot tailor the sermon in real time to speak to immediate concerns or events in a particular congregation because the sermon is usually recorded. But when I spoke with Christians at US-based locations of these Korean churches, it was remarkable how they understood the audiovisual media not to be a rupture in how they thought about religious practice. It was not really a disruption for them. Instead, the screens helped to facilitate their religious practice in a seamless way. They incorporated the technology into their religious understanding of how the Holy Spirit flows across space, and even thought of the screens as an extension of the pastor's hands, capable of transmitting a healing spiritual touch through the screen. Still, you might wonder why anyone would choose to go to a campus of a multi-site church over any other local church. Why go to a church, for example, if you know yourself to be far removed from where the preaching or the main kind of decisions take place in the church? This is where aesthetics and design are important to the appeal of a multi-site church. In Korean American churches in particular, many congregants had previously attended a campus of that same multi-site church in South Korea. So after they moved to the US, the opportunity to attend a campus within the same church network provided the comfort of a familiar setting in what was otherwise a very unfamiliar place to them. For this reason, multi-site churches and the pastors within them take great care to be consistent with how each church location is designed. The walls of the sanctuary might have the same wood veneer, for example, or the type of food served after services would all be consistent. Churches in the US might even import the same exact furniture, the same chairs and tables that they used in the main sanctuaries in Seoul, even though this would come at great expense, of course. This is because the way that the church is experienced through the senses has been critical to creating a sense of unity and belonging. This is the kind of familiarity that often brings people to a multi-site church. And as one quote here on the slide says from a congregant I talked to in Los Angeles, she loved how it even smelled a bit like the Seoul sanctuary she remembered at her Los Angeles church. Now, what can this tell us about people today? First of all, I think that it demonstrates that religious communities and their traditions can be quite flexible and creative in accommodating new tools and organizational structures. Of course, this is not without its challenges, and using different media technologies, for example, does change one's religious practice. But as many people around the world have had to learn firsthand during the COVID-19 pandemic, those changes they may not completely invalidate the mediated rituals. So while the sense of being displaced from one's religious community is fairly new for many people during the pandemic, diasporic churches like South Korean multi-site churches have been using broadcast technologies to create community despite being separated from others in their churches for generations. And so there's a lot to learn about how they have sort of learned to adapt and create new strategies to create a certain sense of unity and belonging across difference. But more generally, I think that this shows that there is really a wide variety of human experiences around the world. And this is something that anthropologists like myself really thrive on. It is what motivates us to do our work, because learning about the lives and experiences of other people can help us to also reflect on our own lives and the possibilities that there might be for living otherwise. So in this case, the long-term experiences of South Korean churches and the Korean diaspora in general can help less experienced multi-site churches or Christians who worship online during the pandemic think about the challenges and opportunities that there are in creating dispersed religious communities. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed listening today. If you did, please check out the blog that goes along with this message and other videos that are featured as a part of Human Stories.
Peace and light to you and yours. So I sometimes do this and do that.